Heavy metal is a diverse genre of music. It originally grew out of rock music, but it's a little different from rock because it's essentially rock music which has been taken to the extreme, and it often focuses on aggression and a grandioseness. Heavy metal has diversified into innumerable subgenres, and it's had periods of high and low popular interest, but it remains today, something like 54, 55 years after its creation, is a diverse and thriving genre of music. What we now know as heavy metal started out in the 1970s. That decade was a very unique decade in the history of the West. The social revolution that happened in the 1960s would be expanded on artistically throughout the decade. And one of those artistic creations, of course, is heavy metal. In the 1970s, heavy metal didn't really have a subculture yet. It was still viewed as just another part of rock music. Heavy metal would, of course, arise out of the heavy psychedelic rock of the late 1960s. Psychedelic rock was a global movement all across the globe, from the United States, the United Kingdom, to Japan. A lot of these psychedelic bands, some of them were very pop-light and light, but many of them were also experimenting with crushing guitar-driven sounds and Hammond organs-driven sounds, and playing with distortion. And those bands that were playing with distortion, what they opened the door to was heavy metal. A lot of people would say that these bands like Coven, bands like Iron Butterfly, Blue Cheer, even Jimi Hendrix or Cream, these weren't truly metal yet, and so in retrospect, a lot of people will call it proto-metal. But we can see here the real footsteps of what would become heavy metal, right? Heavy metal comes from the Steppenwolf song Born to Be Wild, a heavy psychedelic rock song, and a lot of bands at this time began to use occult lyrics and imagery in their music, in particular Coven and Black Widow. The real dawn of heavy metal, though, would come in 1970. In that year, we saw the first Black Sabbath album, the first Uriah Heep album, and the first Mark II, if you will, Deep Purple album in rock. These bands, they came out of the United Kingdom, and they would take that distorted sound of heavy psychedelic rock with the riffs of blues rock, and they would birth heavy metal. They would, of course, talk about occult themes, but also fantasy, a type of genre or a lyrical choice which is almost defined by metal as the only type of music that really talks about fantasy in depth. At this point, though, there were, of course, the standard lyrical choices of rock music still developing, still right there. Songs about sex, songs about love, they're still very common during this period. Some of these bands, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, they're going to be extremely commercially successful, but there are also a lot of bands in this early first wave of heavy metal that would have one album and be done and be lost forever. Something that's really defining about this early era of metal is that Hammond organs are just as much of lead instruments as guitars are. Out of that early wave of heavy metal, a lot of other bands that we don't quite consider metal, but were very popular in the 1970s, are something that we usually just call hard rock. A lot of bands in this 1970s era of hard rock would ultimately be some of the most commercially successful rock bands in history. Bands like Van Halen, Aerosmith, AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, Kiss, Blue Oyster Cult. These are gigantic bands. But a lot of people look back at them, and despite them having, distorted guitar, riff-centric songs, they don't quite cross the board into a lot of people viewing them as metal. But it's a pretty awesome era of music. Everybody likes at least some of these songs. And another thing that's different about it is it's very, very focused on sex and relationships, which is different, of course, than a focus on occult and a focus on fantasy. But later in the 70s, there was kind of a second wave of heavy metal. Bands like Judas Priest, Budgie, Rainbow, Sorcery, Riot, Most of these bands coming out of the United Kingdom, and what you see in these later half of the 70s bands is that are kind of abandoning this blues focus that you would see in your Black Sabbaths and your Deep Purples, and they're abandoning the use of the Hammond organ, and a lot of them are using the guitar as just that main central instrument alone, and with Judas Priest, they're taking two lead guitarists playing in harmony. And you look at a lot of these bands too that are coming out in the second half of the 70s, and the way that they're putting out their albums, these bright, colorful fantasy covers, that's going to become the standard throughout the rest of the history of the genre. And that will bring us into the 1980s. The 1980s, to a lot of people, is definitely seen as the golden age for heavy metal. This is an era in which a lot of genres started to come out, and a lot of bands would sell millions and millions of copies. And this is where metal kind of drew the most public attention, right? We have all these controversies surrounding Satanism and the Satanic Panic, which are going to attack metal artists and try to censor them. Metal is going to spread out of the United Kingdom, out of the United States, all throughout Europe, through Latin America, into Japan, into Asia, throughout the entire world, and become a truly global phenomenon, breaking off from rock music and being defined as its own separate genre. And to start that off in the 1980s, we of course have the new wave of British heavy metal. Of course, centered in the United Kingdom, British is in the title, right? These bands are bands extremely influenced by Judas Priest, with that dual guitar melodic sound, with guitars having harmony together. And this movement is kind of what you could say is the foundation, which is pivotal in forming that distinct subculture that makes metal metal, makes it different from rock as a whole. This is where you start to see heavy metal fashion arise, and this is where you get to see a DIY mentality start to arise in the subculture. And some of these bands are going to be commercially successful, like your Iron Maidens and your Saxons, but there's almost an innumerable amount of bands that arose at this time and only have one or two albums and would be lost to obscurity. This sound of the new wave of British heavy metal, outside of the context of Britain, it's usually just called traditional heavy metal, and it kind of starts right there in 1979, 1980. And it's global. It's a sound that exists to this day. People, of course, would have just called it heavy metal at the time, but 40 odd years later, we're going to have to call it traditional heavy metal. These songs are usually medium paced, not too fast, not too slow, a more traditional rock, more rock-like song structure compared to more extreme metal that we'll see later on. And as I said before, a lot of focus on fantasy, a lot of focus on life struggles going on, this declining interest with these staples of rock, lyricism, declining interest in sexuality in heavy metal is something you're definitely going to see during this period, and the rising of this identity of heavy metal and this interest in metal and its culture. And that brings us to heavy metal subculture. Like I said before, this is something that arose out of the new wave of British heavy metal, goes into the American thrash scene, the German thrash scene, spreads throughout the entire world. Metal fans would, of course, become known as metalheads and headbangers. You'd start to see distinctive clothing, which is usually modeled after biker clothing, a lot of focus on leather, a lot of focus on denim, but of course having patches to identify with your favorite bands, black band t-shirts as well to identify yourself with your band, and long hair is very important, and it's a commitment to the genre. And of course you would see the devil horns, the index finger and the pinky being held out while the other fingers are held down, is a symbol throughout all of metal would arise. Metal fans usually are working class or middle class men who champion resilience, stoicism, and a sense of belonging within the community. The term headbanger, it comes from the distinctive rhythmic dancing style that metalheads do to the beat. In metal, of course, there's this very important sense of authenticity and commitment to the community. And this can include a mild hazing when people will be made fun of for liking other types of music, which is not considered metal enough or cool enough, you could say, or even other types of metal, which isn't considered heavy enough. Of course, that brings us to glam metal. Glam metal is, of course, one of the most popular subgenres of metal and one of the most popular musical styles in history, with multiple diamond albums, 10 million plus sellers to its name. Glam metal came out of the Sunset Strip in LA. Numerous bands came out of there, and then it spread across the world, with bands coming from Europe, coming from Japan, and coming from the East Coast of the United States. Glam metal combines that distortion and aggression of heavy metal, but often includes pop hooks in its music, shorter song structures, and a lot of the times we'll have gang vocals where the chorus of the songs will be sung together by the entire band as opposed to just the singer by himself. In distinction with most other types of metal, the lyrics focus on sex, relationships, drugs, and partying, kind of a staple in rock music. So a lot of the times there's a secondary nickname to glam metal that will come up, sleaze metal. And glam metal, very important, spread metal far and wide, defines the 80s in a lot of people's eyes. And it will often get disqualified and derided by other metal fans because it wasn't true enough. It was selling out. It was half metal. It was pansy metal, right? The title itself, glam metal, comes from a tendency to cross-dress and wear girlish clothing and wear makeup in the music. Speed metal. Now, speed metal is the next step of evolution from traditional metal. This is where you're speeding up the sound. It's becoming a lot faster beats. You're starting to use double kick drums. And this speed metal, it would evolve into something more out there, more aggressive. Thrash metal. Thrash metal was heavy metal taken to the extreme. Thrash metal, the vocals would start to become shouted and yelled instead of sung. The guitars would become increasingly crunchy, and of course, this driven need to become faster and faster. While some bands, of course, are going to have melody in their songs, thrash begins to drop melody in its quest for speed. It takes that speed influence from hardcore punk and dramatically increases its aggression. There were, of course, in the United States, the scene in the Bay Area, the scene in New York, and the scene in Los Angeles, but there were also many other thrash bands scattered throughout the United States and Canada. Thrash bands who were a little bit faster, had a little bit more simpler songs, and just had a general more influence of hardcore punk. Those were called crossover thrash bands. New York is kind of the center of it, but there are crossover bands all throughout the United States and Canada. Instead of thrash metal having kind of darker lyrics, crossover thrash can often be a lot funnier, and sometimes these bands would parody the political lyrics of hardcore. At the same time the thrash scene in the United States and Canada was exploding, there was also the German thrash scene. These bands come from Germany, but also Austria and Switzerland. These bands are a lot more aggressive usually than their American peers, with a lot of screaming, but they do use English, although often broken, to try and appeal to an international audience. These bands often overlap with the beginning of black metal as well, and something that's really interesting about German thrash is there's a lot of 3 pieces, as opposed to 4 or 5 piece bands. At the same time the German and American, Canadian scenes were going on, there was the Brazilian scene. Starting out right as the country transitions into a democracy, in 1985, a numerous amount of Brazilian bands would start experimenting, becoming some of the heaviest bands in the world. This scene's interesting because most of the music is self-released by the bands instead of labels. Again, a lot of influence from hardcore, and just really aggressive. A lot of these bands would become the early foundations of black metal and death metal. At that same time as these bands in thrash were trying to become as heavy and aggressive as they possibly could, and bands in glam metal were trying to become more commercial, trying to appeal to more people, having a lot of melody, having a lot of pop hooks, especially those gang vocals. There's this feud brewing in heavy metal between these glam bands and these thrash bands. And as these two musical styles go in these two opposite directions, what's left in the middle? What about that traditional heavy metal sound? Well, I got something for you, and it's called power metal. Power metal would come out of two different scenes using the same title of power metal. One scene was in the US and the other scene was in Europe. The US scene uses mid-range lyrics, operatic vocals, and focuses on fantasy. The European scene, very similar, focus on fantasy, focus on operatic and clean vocals, but also an increased speed. Power metal is very fast, very melodic, and focused on harmony. This European style of power metal would just become named power metal in most people's eyes. Starting in Germany, it would spread throughout Europe and the rest of the world. Out of the American power metal scene, though, there were a lot of bands that were starting to become more experimental, becoming more technical, becoming more conceptual in their work, taking influence from progressive rock, and from that would be birthed progressive metal. Now, there is a certain type of progressive metal that came out initially, these Dream Theaters, these King's X's, these Fates Warning types bands, but as time would go on, there would be progressive metal of every single variety of metal mixed with progressive rock is progressive metal. That brings us to the 90s. The 90s, the point in time where metal fell from grace as being a commercially successful genre, where alternative rock rises up and metal gets to be killed for good, in quotes. Despite this decline in popularity, the 1990s is a high point for the genre, because this is the period where it flowers to become incredibly diverse, with numerous albums coming out with real artistic merit. And part of the decline in metal's popularity isn't necessarily due to a decline in quality, more just a decline in people moving on to something else because they have fickle taste. But it was also matched by a rise of extreme metal, which kind of put normies off of the genre as well. So, the first thing we really need to talk about when talking about the 90s is grunge. Grunge is a mixture of alternative rock and kind of like 1970s hard rock that comes out of the Seattle area, rising out of its punk rock scene. And it uses a lot of distorted guitar. A lot of those bands that are connected to the grunge movement, they're also connected to the sludge metal movement and the drone metal movement. These bands are really heavy. They're experimenting with distortion. Now, usually, grunge is seen as the opposite of metal, the killer of metal, the destroyer of metal. But I feel like if you listen to a lot of grunge, it's very similar to metal. It's a type of hard rock. It's very aggressive. It has gruff, sometimes screaming vocals. And while it uses alternative song structures, it is a very aggressive style compared to most of alternative rock. Groove metal. Now, groove metal evolves out of the United States thrash scene, and at the time it would be called post-thrash because a lot of bands that were coming into this style of music, they were originally thrash bands, and now they're moving into this new groove metal, if you will. And groove metal is really riff-centered, mid-tempo, and of course it has a groove in it. But it really does maintain that crunchy guitar sound which is associated with thrash metal. As time would go on, a lot of these bands would become popular in the 2000s and they would get the label New Wave of American Metal. Finally, that brings us to extreme metal. Extreme metal. If metal wasn't extreme enough already. These are bands which abandon clean sung vocals altogether, that experiment wildly with aggressive song structures and aggressive, harsh tones in their music, which is indifferent to popular mainstream success Extreme metal evolved out of the thrash scene in the late 1980s, and is glam metal and thrash metal kind of got pushed out of the way in mainstream popularity by grunge and other forms of alternative rock. The metal scene kind of focused more on this extreme metal, and it became so emblematic of metal at that time that a lot of people just kind of think all metal is extreme metal to this day. It's just kind of synonymous with a lot of people's minds of what metal is. So much to the point that a lot of, if you ask somebody, a lot of bands will be demetalled or will no longer be considered metal because they're not extreme metal. This abrasive sound kind of is a double-edged sword, though, because it makes it harder for more people to come into the scene, but it also bonds people much more closely and makes them much more ferocious in their fanship of the music. And of course, like I said before, extreme styles of singing which no longer even resemble singing, monster-like vocals, and extreme metal usually does not shy away from subject matter in its lyrics, which will put off most normal people, talking about gore, talking about death, talking about Satanism, and it will have pretty out there album covers to match that. The most famous form of extreme metal is, of course, death metal, coming out of the mid 1980s, centers in Florida, has this brutal, dry guitar sound, more riff focused actually than thrash metal, and can be faster than thrash metal and slower than thrash metal. And of course, the name death metal comes up with this obsession with horror, with gore, with serial killers, with all things associated with brutal deaths, and of course, Satanism to boot. Death metal is kind of famous because a lot of album covers will be very gory and offensive, and band names will be offensive too. And death metal is most famous probably for its use of Cookie Monster-like growled vocals. Also at this time, you're going to see the emergence of the blast beat. That's where you have double kick drums played so fast that they create a beat that clicks together where you can't tell where one drum beat ends and the other one begins. At the same time that there's this Florida scene, there's also this Swedish scene of death metal arising. There's a conventional death metal scene that comes out of Stockholm, and what we'd see later, a melodic death metal scene in Gothenburg. Swedish death metal is known for its buzzsaw guitar sound through playing the distortion pedal of a Boss HM2 or a Boss DS1 distortion pedal. Swedish death metal is often seen as being a lot more experimental than the American scene, and it would prove to be experimental throughout the world, including back into the American scene. And that brings us to melodic death metal. This is coming out of Gothenburg, and this is a big deal. A lot of death metal bands would become this melodic death metal style, using death metal riffs and death metal vocals, but also mixing it with this classic metal kind of song structure and this deep sense of harmony, melody, and dueling guitars working together in harmony. Some of these bands would be nicknamed At the Gates Worship due to that seminal band's influence on the genre. Technical death metal, or maybe we should just call it progressive death metal. It's death metal taken to a very technical, experimental type of music, which is very difficult to play and takes a lot of influence from jazz, actually. Focuses on a high premium in its musicianship. Very complex, very fast, and sometimes you'll see stuff like keyboards and other instruments not often found in death metal. Now we move to grindcore. Grindcore is like death metal, but even that taken to more of an extreme. It starts out in the UK and spreads throughout the world, and there's a lot of grindcore in places you wouldn't expect, countries like Indonesia, Bohemia, Singapore. It actually came out of the hardcore punk scene rather than the metal scene, and so it's usually the most extreme, fastest form of kind of like a punk song, but those crunchy, brutal, dry guitar riffs and that Cookie Monster growls coming out of it. And a lot of songs in grindcore are less than a minute long. I don't know how you can make sense of a lot of the vocals. They're not just Cookie Monster screams a lot, or Cookie Monster growls or whatever. Sometimes they're just weird animals squealing, stuff like pig squeals or cricket noises. And grindcore actually, because it comes out of hardcore, often has some pretty far left-wing political beliefs associated with it. Next up out of that grindcore scene comes goregrind. Goregrind comes out of Carcass, sometimes called Carcass Worship. Very important band out of the United Kingdom, Carcass. And it uses a lot of brutal imagery and focuses on gore, of course, instead of left-wing political lyrics. And sometimes will have very medically accurate descriptions of disembowelment and dismembering. Vocals are often altered through pitch shifting to create artificial noises that humans cannot create on their own. And it often has pretty purposely lo-fi production values to add an extra dimension of fucked up in there. And of course, not all gore grind bands are going to focus on gore. There's an offshoot of gore grind called porno grind, which focuses on degenerate sex and pornography. Now we move on to black metal. Black metal, it became known to the public in the 1990s, but a lot of those bands that became popular in the 90s, they said that they were originally coming out of bands and influenced by bands from the 1980s, bands like Venom, Hellhammer, Bathory. And so this early wave of black metal is interesting because there's no regional scene. It's basically bands, sometimes earlier than thrash metal, trying to become as heavy as they possibly can, very DIY, trying to focus on pushing themselves forward, one-man bands, no label support, just doing everything on their own, and really focused on this more simpler, raw, repetitive tremolo picking, and a lot of abrasive satanic lyrics. And that brings us into what we could just call black metal. That initial very popular scene of second wave black metal focuses in Norway, spreads throughout the world. Again, this very extreme DIY mentality, very anti-commercial, focus on lo-fi production values. Some of these bands are so anti-commercial, they say that they'll never play live and only exist in the studio. Black metal would begin with satanic and pagan lyrics, but as time went on, a lot of taboo topics also came up, such as far right-wing politics and nationalist themes. Black metal is probably one of the most experimental forms of metal, with bringing in keyboards, symphonic elements, acoustic instrumentation, and folk instruments. Black metal, of course, like death metal, has double kick drums creating that blast beat, but instead of Cookie Monster vocals, has screamed or shrieked vocals. And kind of black metal's taken to the extreme, that's war metal. It is very DIY as well, mixes that early black metal sound with elements of death metal and grime, and has this primitive, repetitive, stripped down sound, and its focus is usually on war. And another offshoot of black metal is folk metal. Black metal would, interestingly, with how experimental it would be, would often bring in folk instrumentation, folk instruments, acoustic instrumentation, and out of that would arise folk metal. That, of course, is just mixing heavy metal with folk metal. Oftentimes, folk metal is focused on paganism. As we saw before, death metal, black metal, grindcore, thrash metal, and so on usually focuses on going as fast as they can. Doom metal's the opposite. We're slowing down song structures, really focusing on crushing riffs to create this impending and crushing sense of doom. That's where it gets the title from. Doom metal is interesting because it does start in the 1980s, but doesn't really get famous until you get to the 90s when all these other extreme brands of metal are coming out. Doom metal, it often focuses on depression and substance abuse, but also the occult and fear of the occult rather than relishing in Satanism. And a lot of bands would actually have Christian themes. A lot of people say that doom metal is basically just Black Sabbath riff-offs, and there's some truth to that because every doom metal band looks to Black Sabbath as the mold that they must focus on. Doom metal, unlike grindcore and black metal and death metal, often has clean-sung vocals, which can be very sorrowful. That brings us to sludge metal, a more extreme, more aggressive brand of doom metal, which focuses on riffs a lot, but instead of having clean vocals, often has highly emotional screaming, and its lyrics focus on self-loathing, hate, nihilism, just generally negative emotions. And it actually comes more out of the hardcore scene than from the metal scene, with bands like Black Flag and Flipper kind of taking the hardcore sound and adding more and more distortion until you come up with sludge metal. Another offshoot of doom metal would be stoner rock. Stoner rock comes out of the Inland Empire and the Palm Desert scene of California, so it's alternatively known as desert rock. Stoner rock takes some influence from the alternative rock scene and grunge. There's some connections there. But really, what defines stoner rock, I think, is this kind of 70s worship, this love and all nostalgia for all things 70s, as rockabilly focuses on the culture of the 50s and early 1960s. In turn, desert rock or stoner rock focuses on the culture of the 1970s. Lyrics often talk about, the 1970s in general. Stoners in the title, so they talk about pot. And there's a lot of focus on stuff like road trips, a lot of car culture stuff. Stoner rock, coming influenced by doom metal, has slow tempos with a lot of extreme distortion. I think the really big difference between stoner rock and doom metal, though, is doom metal has this very downbeat, kind of depressing tone, while stoner rock is very upbeat and uplifting. Of course, combining doom metal and stoner rock together is where you get stoner metal. And you're going to have bands like Sleep that come out of that whole stoner rock scene. But stoner metal is going to be pretty global, and it's going to be very aggressive. It incorporates screaming and yelling and harsh vocals, unlike stoner rock. And it's very focused on having these hugely crushing, just the thickest distorted rock guitar tones that you can have. Coming out of doom metal, very riff focused, very slow music, and even more so than stoner rock, just an absolute focus on pot. Almost everything lyrically in the genre focuses on pot. Next up, we have Funeral Doom. Funeral Doom comes out of Finland's doom metal scene in the 1990s, and it comes from slowing down doom metal to be unbelievably slow and taking the musical tones and beats of funeral dirges and mixing it with doom metal to create this kind of very sorrowful and melodramatic sound. Lyrics focusing on depression and this overwhelming sense of doom. And the vocals are often from death metal, the same growling Cookie Monster type of vocals you'd see there. Then you have even slower, the slowest type of metal you can have. Drone metal takes its influence from ambient music. Bands coming out of that grunge scene from Washington State and other bands coming out of Japan. Takes doom metal, mixes it with noise rock, mixes it with ambient, and just very experimental weirdness and extremely slow and minimalistic song structures. People make fun of it because of its excessive amounts of reverb. Another offshoot of the doom metal scene is Gothic metal. Gothic metal, of course, is goth rock, goth subculture, plus heavy metal. The initial scene of goth metal came out of the United Kingdom with the three bands, the Peaceville Three, if you will, that were signed to Peaceville Records: Anathema, My Dying Bride, and Paradise Lost. These were initially doom death bands, or death doom, whatever you want to call it, bands. Death metal played at a doom metal tempo and focus on doom metal riffs. But these bands would become very experimental and would incorporate a lot of elements of gothic rock into their sound. And as time went on, out of them came this flowering of this mixture of goth rock and heavy metal, taking in these influence from orchestras and electronic music and alternative rock. A lot more female vocalists than any other type of metal. And you see this kind of style known as the Beauty and the Beast style, where you have clean vocals sung by a woman and harsh death metal vocals sung by a man. Funk metal. Funk metal is interesting because it kind of comes out of that same scene of glam metal, but these bands are focusing on mixing heavy metal with funk. Funk, of course, the dominant instrument in that genre is not the electric guitar, but rather the electric bass. And so these funk bands, these funk metal bands, if you will, oftentimes they're very good musicians, very experimental, and they're going to bring in this goofy, fun, comedic attitude, and their lyrics are going to match that. Conventional singing, but also rapping and scatting comes into it. Out of funk metal is going to come, though, new metal. Comes out of a Southern California initial scene, too. Mixes funk metal and groove metal together to create this new, unique sound. New metal is very different in that it has very introspective lyrics, which often focus on child abuse and family trauma. It appeals to usually middle schoolers and high schoolers that are going through these issues in their lives. And despite being made fun of and even getting the negative nickname new spelled wrong metal, it has stuck around for decades at this point and has become very popular. New metal would become popular starting with Korn and other bands of that ilk breaking out into the mainstream again and creating another golden period for heavy metal at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. New metal, of course, can have normal, clean vocals, but often this kind of whispering, intense tone in their singing. And then it will scream and yell, creating this natural instinct for a quiet, loud dynamic. A closely associated genre with new metal is alternative metal, usually coming out of the same exact scene of Southern California, and there's a great amount of overlap. Alternative metal is kind of just a label that you put on everything that you could say is metal, but doesn't quite fit everything else and has a big alternative rock influence. It takes that alternative rock mellowness often in its lyrics, and it's experimental, but often has yelling and screaming and, the guitars and aggression and distortion of heavy metal. These bands often really focus on a quiet, loud dynamic in their music. At the same time that you have new metal and alternative metal, you have rap metal. Rap metal is mostly coming out of the United States. Of course, the vocals are going to be rapped. It's very similar often to new metal. It's an instrumentation. It's just that it has rapping, a very different vocal style that's seen, of course, nowhere else in heavy metal. Influence in its song structures is also going to come from the birthplace of rap, the hip-hop genre, and you're going to have turntables incorporated in the music and samples. Lyrics are often upbeat and centered around partying or kind of just catchy nonsense lyrics. The music generally has this upbeat and bouncy quality to it. Kind of loosely associated with alternative metal, this whole alternative metal kind of superstructure, if you will, is industrial metal. It comes out of the scene in Chicago and just mixes the most aggressive form of electronic music, industrial, with the most aggressive form of rock music, heavy metal. Some of these bands are more industrial than metal, where the guitar parts and the bass parts and the drum parts are actually sampled with other industrial parts to create the sound. And sometimes it's a metal band that has samples from industrial music to create the infamous metallic industrial sound, this outer worldly, no longer human sounding music, machine sounding music, if you will. The lyrics of industrial are often very nihilistic, very angsty, very angry. And the singing can be all over the place. You have shouting, screaming, the whisper type of vocals that you see in new metal, and just normal singing. The German variety of industrial metal is unique, so that it even gets its own title, Neue Deutsch Hart. I probably mispronounced it, but whatever. New German Hardness. That's the name we give for the industrial metal scene of Germany in the 1990s and 2000s. These bands, they incorporate a lot more from electronic than just the aggressiveness of industrial. These songs are often a lot more danceable, more melodic choruses, and a lot of clean singing. Unlike other popular styles centered in Germany, like Germany's thrash metal or power metal, a lot of these bands use German lyrics rather than English lyrics for popular worldwide audiences. And that puts us into the 2000s. The 2000s was a rebirth for metal in popularity with the new metal movement, the industrial metal movement, and just kind of a revival of a lot of these bands that were popular in the 80s, reuniting, returning to their old sounds, um, disregarding any kind of like alternative influence that bands like Megadeth and Metallica would place into their music. And it's kind of this silver age for heavy metal. It's also the era when rock music becomes no longer the default most popular music in the United States and becomes replaced by hip hop as the dominant music. The rise of the internet to the worldwide fan base during this era allowed a lot of these obscure genres that were flourishing in the 90s to get exposure everywhere, and a lot of these underground types of metal and these underground bands to begin to market their music more fully. And for bands across the third world where, due to crime or conflict or poverty, it was hard for them to share their music and develop a scene, now they're able to directly share it with each other over the internet. In the beginning of the 2000s, we have an explosion of symphonic metal. It mostly comes from Europe, and it's, of course, what its title is. Symphonic metal, a mix of symphonic music, opera, neoclassical, European folk music, and metal, usually tied in with the power metal scene, but there are also bands that are closely associated with the death metal and black metal scenes. Women singing in this genre is more common than men singing. We see yet another mix of hardcore punk and heavy metal, this time being called metalcore. It comes out of the East Coast hardcore scene of the 1990s, comes out of that era of hardcore, which has a lot of breakdowns, or where all the instruments stop playing at once and then start again. This was used to try and fuel more aggression in the mosh pit. And these bands take that style of songwriting and then incorporate the detuned and distorted guitars and bass of metal into that beat down hardcore style, and then start screaming and shouting in it. Out of this metalcore style comes kind of a more mainstream style, and maybe the third time that heavy metal started appealing to the mainstream and gained mainstream popularity after glam metal and nu metal. Now we have melodic metalcore. And this comes from the American and British metalcore scenes, and they take that template of metalcore, but they also add, the more traditional heavy metal style and melodic death metal into it. A lot of clean sing vocals are juxtaposed with screaming and shouting, and some of these bands are going to become huge sensations, very popular. Mathcore is basically metalcore, but it's progressive twin, a lot like technical death metal. Mathcore is extremely avant-garde and uses very complex song structures. If you listen to any of this, it might just sound like chaos to you, but what's going underneath that is just insane math, if you will, in the musical notation. It's kind of the heavier and more progressive end of metalcore, with a lot of uncontrollable breakdowns and just undecipherable screaming. Now that moves on to deathcore. Deathcore comes out in the mid to late 2000s, pretty dominant all throughout the metal scene in the 2010s, and gets kind of this negative rap because of it. A lot of these bands come out of Southern California and Arizona. Of course, deathcore, what does that mean? We mix death metal and metalcore, and we get deathcore. But it's interesting because death metal often focuses on violence and killing and gore, and there's definitely that in deathcore. A lot of deathcore bands have this more introspective lyrical style, kind of like nu metal. At the same time that you have technical death metal being progressive with death metal, and you have mathcore being progressive with metalcore, now we get post-metal, and post-metal is being progressive with sludge metal. It incorporates influence from the post-rock community, which is a very experimental with non-traditional song structures that don't have traditional harmonies, traditional bridges, traditional choruses, and instead kind of focus on this constant progression and kind of like this almost water-like movement from one song to the other with very long and progressive and different instrumentation and sound signatures. A lot of the times, because these bands are coming out of sludge metal, it's called atmospheric sludge metal. The vocals here are usually screamed or shouted, but a lot of bands can be entirely instrumental. That moves us on to the present day, if you will, the 2010s and beyond. Rock music is declining more and more and is not seen as the mainstream music in the West and is becoming less and less relevant, with almost no modern rock stations to speak of and rock on the radio basically just being classic rock. Despite this decline in mainstream popularity, heavy metal seems to still have an extremely devoted fan base and subculture which crosses the entire globe. It is fractured into numerous subgenres, as we've been talking about through this entire video. And subgenres at this time that would have thought to have been into terminal decline or ceased to exist, stuff like thrash metal, glam metal, traditional heavy metal, all these genres are going to come back and have their own micro scenes everywhere across the world in little pockets, because this era is really defined by the rise of internet self-publishing websites like Bandcamp and Spotify, which allow high-quality music to be put up for streaming across the world for free at any time, and kind of divorces heavy metal and other genres of music from the scene, from being constrained locally to artists around you. Now you're sharing your music to people online rather than your own region or city. And this is kind of a double-edged sword, because a lot of bands, they're playing live less and less, and it's a lot harder for any individual band to stand out. You kind of get this crowding effect, while despite your band being good and having high quality recordings, it really can't stand out because there's thousands and thousands of other bands posting their stuff on Bandcamp and Spotify and YouTube. It's creating, I think, kind of a crisis in the genre, because these legacy bands, these Boomer and Gen X bands, they have huge fan bases and they're still touring and it's still lucrative, and teenagers all the way up ages, all the way through middle age, and even old people are going to see these concerts, but no new bands are getting big enough to start touring and making some real money on their own. One of the most interesting genres that come out during this period is djent. Djent is global, and djent comes from an onomatopoeia for the type of tone that comes from the guitars with its riffing, and this distinct sound comes from detuned 7 or more stringed guitars. Djent kind of gets derided and often called not a genre by metal purists, but if it gets a title and bands identify with it, it's obviously a thing, guys. Djent includes clean singing, shouting, and screaming all across the spectrum, and djent is well known for having these highly complex and progressive song structures. The lyrics of djent are often also very introspective. We also see the rise of black gaze, and it comes out of France, and it basically takes black metal and shoegaze, of course, well, what does the title come from, and slams them together, and takes that ambient sound from shoegaze and post-rock with experimental song structures, but also the tremolo picking and screaming in black metal. Again, these lyrics can be introspective and they're often very cryptic. Next up, we have trap metal. Trap metal, it's different than rap metal, because rap metal is usually the instrumentation of heavy metal, but the singer is rapping. Trap metal is actually the instrumentation and beats of the electronic hip-hop hybrid genre of trap music, but with metal singing over the top, often extreme metals type of singing. Trap metal is kind of at its infancy right now, and a lot of it is kind of, we'll see where it goes. While some of these bands, they were just using trap beats as their main musical instrumentation, over time they're incorporating more and more traditional heavy metal song structures into their music. The vocals, of course, are most influenced by extreme metal. Sometimes you have death growls being rapped out or black metal screeching being rapped out. And the lyrics can be gibberish, or they can be based around infamy or pretty like extreme subject matter, stuff like serial killers or psychopathy. Well, that kind of brings an end to the different genres here, and I want to be a little positive as we close this out. Heavy metal is a very vibrant genre with a global cult following, with some real dedication. And I know that it's at a transition point right now, where a lot of these big bands are starting to age out from their ability to tour, and they're going to be less and less prominent in making new music. Now, there's something to worry about, because while there's numerous young people that want to go forward with this genre and really like it and go to these concerts, a lot of these newer bands, despite being very good, are having traction gaining bigger fan bases. So it's kind of scary for the scene, but I think it's something we should be optimistic about for the future, because I think that metal will find a way, and that as long as there's a devoted fan base who wants to listen to this music and wants to play this music, it's always going to be there for the people that love it.